once upon a time, oil was found in Loibiri several years ago, and we were like, oh yeah, we have oil resources. But despite all we say, the oil is declining, but the gas resource is something that we keep on discovering. And so it's not out of place what the government has already pronounced to say, look, we're going gas. Gas is going to be our energy transition pathway.
Welcome again to another episode of Advocaat's Distinguished Guest Series. Today we're going to be discussing decarbonization and energy transition. Joining me in this discussion is Mr. James Ogunleye. Mr. James Ogunleye is a seasoned engineer and currently the Managing Director of Carbon Limits Nigeria, a company jointly owned by Carbon Limits in Norway and Nigerian investors. He currently works closely with companies in the oil and gas, power and manufacturing sectors on climate change related issues for their projects. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
So can you talk a little bit about Carbon Limits and what you do as the MD on a day-to-day basis?
Okay, thanks for the question. Carbon Limits is a foremost climate and energy company. It's a company which is a joint venture company with Carbon Limits in Oslo. Carbon Limits in Oslo has been around for the past, how many years now? Since 2005. And you also have Carbon Limits Nigeria, formed in 2010. And basically what we do, whether as Carbon Limits Oslo, Carbon Limits Nigeria, is basically looking at climate issues within the energy sector and trying to find solutions to them, basically in the area of mitigation, reducing emissions. That's basically what we do. And what do I do personally as MD of the company? My responsibility is to ensure that I work closely with all these energy companies in Nigeria, particularly those in the oil and gas industries, to try and identify where these emissions are and what would they like to do about them in terms of reduction. And because the energy sector is wide, it's not limited to oil and gas alone. So of course, my interest is also in the power, in the transport sector, and also the industry. So these are areas that I put my focus on a day-to-day basis. So I work on the technical side and on the business development side.
So Carbon Limits is passionate about reducing emissions and improving energy efficiency, especially in the petroleum industry.
Right.
And you do this by adopting disruptive technology. So how do you think, how can you tell us Carbon Limits, how does Carbon Limits go about this? Achieving this goal?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. So what we do is, we don't necessarily offer the technology itself, but we offer advisory as to what kind of technology should you be looking at in terms of these mitigation actions. So if you say from the oil and gas industry, for example, one of the prominent things is the flaring. And reducing flare requires some technologies which is common, and virtually all the industries in the oil and gas, they know and have it. Of course, so what you do is you offer this advisory service in the area of methane emission, which is now new as to how that is being reduced. Offer advisory in terms of what kind of technologies they use, like the leak detection and repair equipment. These are things we do on a day-to-day basis. But remember that these industries have experts of their own. And a lot of times it's not the issue of not having the knowledge of the technology. There's a question of what do you prioritize in the industry? Because you're here looking at trying to increase your oil production and you're trying to see a market for the gas. So you worry about the lesser issues. So that's the point.
So how do you explain carbon markets and carbon finance, and how can they help in a country's emission reduction targets?
So I think you've delved into something completely different, carbon market. And when you say carbon market, you're looking at a situation where some of these emission reductions, because of the cost implications of these activities, you want to be able to also get some benefits as a result of doing this project through carbon markets. And of course, what that does is you setting up, of course, there are several markets at this time. And for us as a country, there is a process to try and see how that can be done. The office, meaning Carbon Limits here in Nigeria, we're helping out in the efforts to try to understand what sort of carbon price can be put, can we have on carbon in Nigeria. And what that implies is that you realize that industries don't necessarily give the same type of return. So if you are looking at an oil and gas, which is part of the energy sector, you look at the power industry. The two, both in energy sector, but the returns you get in these industries are not same. So if you say you're going to put price on carbon, the amount that a company an oil and gas industry is able to pay will definitely be different from what the power sector. So you must be able to do a research across and see what's an appropriate price to put. And that helps you to be able to define a market. And when you put up a market, you're saying that this is the expected emissions that I need you to be able to reduce. Failure to do that, you pay this penalty for every ton of carbon dioxide that you release. And that price, once it is set, everybody work towards reducing emission to reach that target. And where they cannot, they have to pay penalty for the excess that they are emitting. So that's how you set up a market. In many other parts of the world, you've had, for example, in Europe, we've seen it in America, we've seen it in Asia, China, for example. And there's a strong drive to have this in Nigeria. Maybe in the next 1-2 years, who knows? Maybe we'll be there.
Okay, so what about the carbon finance? How does that play in all of this?
So when you say carbon finance, perhaps you also, it's linked to what we have just discussed. And basically, carbon financing is trying to, what you're saying there is you're financing your project, or at least meeting your project with funds that come as a result of carbon. So so that's how it means. So for example, if you want to do a project in oil and gas, you have a flare that you want to reduce, and then you say, on this volume of flare that I'm going to reduce, if I'm able to reduce this amount of this volume of CO2 from a flare, from an industry where you're flaring, given the price of carbon that is known, you could say, this is the expected revenue that I will get once I reduce the CO2. And because it's carbon finance, and when you say carbon finance, it's more like a result-based financing. You don't get money upfront. So nobody pays you money and say, oh, because you're going to reduce. Who knows? You may not. So you have to indeed reduce that emissions before you get paid for it. So what do? What you do is, once you're able to estimate it, once you're able to identify a buyer, once you're able to get, of course, a market for it, so what you do is you put it out there, and the buyer indicates interest with what you call the emission reduction purchase agreement, which is a document that you have put together by lawyers. You put that there and say, this is how much I'll be able to reduce. Sign it off and say, you are buying it at some point. Usually, credible buyers will attract banks. Banks in Nigeria, maybe not there yet, but a lot of people out there, a lot of banks out there, investment companies out there. And I think even in Nigeria, some have started working on, some investment companies will take it, especially when it's coming from credible source. So if I'm going to sell emission reduction to a company that is credible in the UK or Europe for that matter, I might be able to get a bank in Nigeria that will say, yes, I'm interested, and I can pay you upfront as against the emissions that you are reducing, that you will get some funding from the carbon finance. So that's what it works. So carbon finance, carbon market, carbon trading, all these words or jargons you use within the carbon finance space. Yeah.
Okay, so Nigeria is blessed with numerous natural resources, from crude oil to gas to,
Right.
To mining resources and the rest of them. But a lot of these resources are affected by energy transition. So how do you suppose Nigeria can navigate this transition and still harness its resources, especially given the need of the country for revenue?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think one thing we must realize is that the natural, within the oil and gas industry especially, the oil itself, once upon a time, oil was found in Oloibiri several years ago, and we were like, oh yeah, we have oil resources, but despite all we say, the oil is declining, but the gas resource is something that we keep on discovering. And so it's not out of place what the government has already pronounced to say, look, we're going gas. Gas is going to be our energy transition pathway. And that's fine. when you think about it, in the profile of energy resources within the oil and gas or petroleum, gas itself stays low at the spectrum in terms of the emissions that you get from natural gas, where you have diesel, crude itself, and petroleum and the likes of, petrol, the likes of them having a higher emissions. So if you're taking gas, you're taking the lowest of the pyramid, so to speak, in the crude or the petroleum industry as your energy source, which is fine. And what you see is a situation where if we indeed go that way, and using gas for even driving our vehicles, we'll be able to preserve the crude, or so the oil part of what we have from the crude, and we can focus more on the gas, which we have as resource. Because when you look at the analysis and say, how much can we, in terms of gas that we have as a country, even if we consume 10 BCF annually, in a country where you have about 173 trillion cubic feet of gas. So you think what you're using, you've not scratched the surface. So it makes sense to be able to go the pathway of gas. It doesn't stop you from using the renewables as well, but yes, I think the country is on the right path using gas.
Right. Okay, so last year in 2021, Nigeria enacted the Climate Change Act. Some key provisions include the establishment of the Climate Change Fund, carbon budget, and the National Climate Change Action Plan. Right. And it goes further, the act, goes further to impose obligations on MDAs, on private and public entities.
Right.
And these are all aimed at checking emissions. So in your opinion, do you believe that these provisions are sufficient in terms of achieving the aim to reduce greenhouse gas?
Yeah, I think we are in the early days. I think it's too early to say whether it's sufficient or not. I think what you will advocate is to have the start first. Why don't we start first and then we begin to fix the holes? Obviously, there will be holes. This might not be sufficient totally. Even as we speak presently, some people have started looking at how do you implement if you have the Climate Act put in place. But then how do you get all other industries? Because where are the emissions coming from? They're not necessarily coming from Ministry of Environment. They're not going to come from the climate change. It's a desk itself. So it's going to come from all other industries. So you must be able to see how those industries plug into this Climate Change Act. And not until when you put it into full force action before you then begin to identify the leaks and as we the gaps. And as we go on, we begin to close the gaps and begin to identify how to work on it. But I think it's in the right direction, having the Climate Change Act.
Okay. So we're in the days of technology now. How do you think that technology can assist Nigeria to meet its nationally determined contributions, especially as the government the government and several African countries insist that they want to transition at their own pace, and they have totally refused to abandon their natural resources. So how do we go from here?
Well, I think this is a very interesting one. But I think rather than getting too much worry about technology, knowing fully well that no country can survive on its own. So what you will expect going forward is a situation where countries collaborate in terms of how they carry out this. So I tell you, for example, you want to use renewable energy, you want to use solar panels, you'll be expecting countries like maybe Japan, China, provide this technology. And we have the vast land, we have places where these solar panels will thrive well and you can get good outputs from them. And so we could have a relationship that says, okay, we're going to use this technology from your country and we're going to have emission reduction shared in this way, because the Climate Act, the Paris Accord, allows you to have some sort of international transfer mitigation obligation. So the ITMO allows you to be able to do a transfer between yourself and other countries. They come with the technology, you come with the source of the emission reduction, and then you can decide to have an agreement on how that will play out between the two countries. So it's, in the end, for me, it's a win-win. And adapting the technologies over time, this is what you do, getting them to set up plants in your country, and you using that technology will obviously help you out. It doesn't stop us from going our pathway. If we're using gas, we're already thinking compressed natural gas. We're talking of mini LNG now, where the so-called big LNG trains that you have in Bonny Island is no longer just what we have in the country. Now you have Greenville doing some sort of mini LNG, and you have quite a lot of them trying to set up mini LNG plants as well. So it means that the technology is gradually being domesticated, and with that, yes, technology is being applied, but emission reduction pathway, which is the gas, is still utilized, so it's fine.
Okay, I mean, to wrap up, let's talk a bit about in-house, about what Carbon Limits is doing.
Right.
Carbon Limits is engaged in biogas and waste-to-power activities, and I mean, it seems like Carbon Limits is one in the whole space. So, despite the abundant resources, Nigeria is not able to harness, or has not fully harnessed its resources. How do you think Carbon Limits can change this narrative?
Well, I think the point here is that, when you started, I got almost excited saying, yeah, you only won the space. But I have to remind you that this is something that will, of course, bring all other actors into play. Yes, Carbon Limits is doing its bit, but of course, you will need other actors, governments, regulatory agencies to play its part. When you say waste to, if we say biogas, I tell you, for example, as good as biogas is, the best you can utilize it for will have been for cooking, where you don't discriminate about the quality of gas. By the time you're thinking of biogas for, say, generating electricity, then you bring in extra cost, where you're saying you want to scrub the gas, take out the sulfur, because the gas you get from natural gas, especially the natural gas in Nigeria, which is known as a sweet gas.
Yeah.
Sweet gas because it's less or close to zero sulfur. But when you go to biogas, that's not true. You have a lot of, so you have cost on it.
Yeah.
So if you have cost on that side, you have to sit down as an investor, even as a climate lover, to say, what is the best pathway to cook? If you have to generate electricity, you come back to think that your best option is still the natural gas. So there are various things that we're doing as a country that we just need to prioritize. So when I say, yes, it's not a carbon limits decision alone, it's where you need regulators, you need the ministries to come into the space and be able to say, if you want to do this, these are the list of options that you should prioritize, given our goal of emission reduction and utilization of gas. So we must be able to say, what do we want to use gas for? Where do we see biogas as an option? If you ask me, biogas option should be where you have remote farms, places where natural gas cannot easily get to. You can use that for cooking. And where you have to use electricity in remote places, you use solar, because it means that they don't necessarily have to be on grid if they are small places. But when they are big places, you can have mini grid, you can have a captive generation where you don't have reasons to put a transmission line. So we just have to get creative about this, and we just have to get everybody in that space, not just Carbon Limits, to get this thing done, because we just a private company and there's a limit to how much we can do in this space.
I mean, it's a good place to wrap up. Everyone has to come on board to meet our targets.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ogunleye, for joining us. It's been a very nice conversation.
Thank you very much.